At my sister's son's birthday party, they told me my assigned seat was a flimsy plastic folding chair pushed right up against the swinging doors of the men's restroom. I stood there holding my tailored jacket and watched in absolute silence as distant cousins, neighbors, and mere acquaintances clinked crystal champagne flutes at silk-draped VIP tables in the center of the room. My sister Jasmine stood next to me in a tightly fitted designer gown, smirking as if putting me in my place was the absolute highlight of her entire year. She wanted to humiliate me in front of Chicago's elite to show everyone that despite my corporate success, I was still just the scapegoat of our family. She wanted to prove that her life was a magnificent success while mine was merely functional. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give her the angry, emotional reaction she desperately wanted to capture for her social media followers. I simply smiled gracefully, placed my beautifully wrapped gift on the cold marble floor, and walked right out the grand double doors of that exclusive country club without looking back. 10 minutes later, as I cruised down the highway, enjoying the quiet peace of my luxury sedan, my phone lit up with frantic back-to-back calls. When I finally accepted the call, Jasmine was no longer smirking. She was practically hyperventilating, choking on her own tears. The country club manager had just cut the power to the entire grand ballroom. They had locked the expensive buffet doors and were loudly threatening to call the local police because her husband's credit card had been shockingly declined for the $40,000 final balance. Jasmine begged me to turn my car around and use my money to save them from total social ruin. She ordered me to come back and fix her massive financial mess like I always did in the past. But she did not know I had already locked down every financial safety net she thought she had. My name is Valerie. I am 34 years old, and I am a mergers and acquisitions executive specializing in corporate debt restructuring. For years, my family treated me like an invisible ATM while endlessly praising my sister, the self-proclaimed luxury lifestyle influencer. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my toxic family's fake empire in one single day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe right now if you have ever had to set ruthless boundaries with relatives who completely underestimated your power and your worth. The true story of how I brought my sister and her arrogant husband to their knees begins earlier that sunny Saturday afternoon. I pulled my car up to the valet stand of the Oak Brook Country Club, one of the most prestigious and notoriously expensive venues in the entire state of Illinois. I was there to celebrate my nephew Leo turning 7 years old. Even though my family constantly drained my energy, I loved my nephew deeply and wanted to show up for him. I walked through the towering glass doors, carrying a large gift box, feeling genuinely optimistic about the day. But the disrespect started the exact moment I approached the front reception desk. Two sharply dressed receptionists looked me up and down with obvious judgment. I politely gave them my name, but they coldly claimed I was not on the primary VIP guest list. They made me stand to the side like an unwanted party crasher, while hundreds of wealthy guests streamed past me dressed in extravagant outfits. I waited for 20 agonizing minutes checking my watch before my sister Jasmine finally appeared. Jasmine strutted across the grand lobby, looking like she belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine rather than a child's birthday party. She wore heavy makeup, sparkling diamond jewelry, and a forced smile designed entirely for her cameras. Without even saying hello or thanking me for coming, she grabbed my arm tightly and pulled me away from the beautiful entrance. She did not lead me toward the stunning floral archways or the towering champagne pyramids in the center of the ballroom. Instead, she dragged me toward a dark, drafty hallway at the very back of the venue. The joyful music faded away, and the sharp smell of harsh cleaning chemicals grew stronger with every step. She stopped right outside the swinging wooden doors of the men's restroom. There, sitting entirely by itself on the bare floor, was a rusted metal folding chair with a cheap plastic seat. There was no table, there was no silverware, there was not even a simple cloth napkin. It looked exactly like a time-out chair for a misbehaving child. Jasmine crossed her arms and pointed a manicured finger at the sad little seat. She told me the main room was at full capacity because her husband Trent had invited his most important technology investors. She looked me right in the eye and said my boring business suit would ruin the glamorous aesthetic of the main dining room. She actually expected me to sit by the toilets breathing in bathroom freshener, while she and her wealthy white husband paraded around like royalty. The sheer audacity of her insulting demand hit me like a physical blow to the chest. But instead of fighting back right then, I noticed the nervous twitch in her eye and the way she anxiously gripped her expensive designer purse. Something was deeply wrong with her perfect, wealthy life, and I was about to find out exactly what it was. I took a deep breath and stared at the plastic chair. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had lent them over the years. This pathetic seat was my reward for playing the supportive sister. The games were finally over. I was ready to burn their beautiful fake world straight down to the ground forever. I turned to my sister and kept my voice perfectly level. I asked her if she seriously expected me to sit in a dark hallway eating birthday cake next to a public toilet. Jasmine rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in her head. She let out a sharp, dramatic sigh and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. She told me I was being overly sensitive and ruining the entire vibe of her son's special day. She pointed a perfectly manicured acrylic nail toward the grand ballroom. Through the open doors, I could see waiters in crisp white tuxedos passing around trays of expensive caviar and pouring vintage champagne. Jasmine proudly stated that the main dining room was strictly reserved for the wealthy white investors who were funding her husband Trent's new technology company. She said these were very important men from Silicon Valley, and they expected a certain level of elegance that I simply did not possess. Jasmine stepped closer and practically sneered at my tailored charcoal blazer. She told me I looked like a depressed tax accountant, and that my boring corporate suit completely clashed with the luxury pastel aesthetic she had carefully curated for the party. She actually had the nerve to say that hiding me in the hallway was a huge favor. She claimed she was saving me from feeling painfully out of place among people of high society. I stared at her heavily contoured face and felt a bitter laugh rising in my throat. I knew exactly how much her designer dress cost, because she had cried to our mother about being broke just last month. Yet here she was acting like a billionaire socialite while treating her own flesh and blood like a contaminated object. Before I could tell Jasmine exactly where she could shove that plastic folding chair, I heard the familiar sound of heavy footsteps clicking aggressively against the marble floor. It was our mother Brenda. She marched toward us wearing a massive wide-brimmed hat and a stunning silk dress. A dress I knew for a fact was purchased using the emergency credit card I had given her for her supposed medical expenses. Instead of asking why her youngest daughter was being banished to a restroom hallway, my mother immediately took Jasmine's side. She grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly tight, and pulled me further into the shadows. She hissed at me through clenched teeth, telling me to lower my voice even though I was speaking at a completely normal volume. My mother told me I was acting bitter and jealous just like I always did when we were growing up. She launched into her usual twisted speech about how hard Jasmine worked to maintain her flawless image and how Trent was on the verge of closing a massive business deal that would elevate our entire family name. She looked me dead in the eye and told me to know my place. She said I was a single black woman who chose a dry, loveless corporate career over building a real family. She told me I should be on my knees, thanking them for even inviting me to witness this level of excellence. The absolute delusion in her voice was staggering, but unfortunately, it was nothing new. She continued her vicious lecture telling me that Trent's wealthy white investors were not used to our kind of loud family drama. She ordered me to swallow my pride, sit quietly on the folding chair, and stay completely out of sight. She reminded me that Jasmine had given her a beautiful mixed-race grandson, and that achievement alone made her the true pride of our family. My mother actually had the audacity to say that my financial success meant absolutely nothing if I could not support my sister when it mattered most. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in my stomach. For 34 years I had paid her medical bills, funded her vacations, and bailed her out of every single financial disaster she or Jasmine had ever created. And yet she looked at me with pure contempt. She worshipped a son-in-law she barely knew just because he wore expensive watches, threw around technology buzzwords, and offered her proximity to white wealth. My mother adjusted her expensive silk scarf and gave me a final warning. She ordered me to sit down, smile, and not speak to any of the important guests unless I was spoken to first. She told me my only job today was to drop off my gift and fade into the background so I would not embarrass Trent in front of his board of directors. Jasmine smirked triumphantly, standing behind our mother, like a spoiled child who had just won a grand prize. They both looked at me, expecting me to fold. They expected me to swallow the heavy lump of humiliation in my throat and accept the blatant disrespect. They thought I would just take it, because that is what strong Black women are always conditioned to do in our family. We are taught to bear the weight, take the insult, and keep the family peace, no matter how much it destroys us inside. I looked at my mother and saw nothing but a woman completely blinded by superficial greed and a desperate need for social validation. I looked at my sister and saw a pathetic fraud desperately clinging to a lifestyle she could not afford. They thought they held all the power because they had the big house and the flashy party. But they had no idea that I held the keys to their entire existence. I had spent years analyzing bad debts and failing companies for a living. I knew exactly what financial ruin looked like, and I knew exactly how close they were to the absolute edge. I stood there in the dimly lit hallway listening to the sound of men walking in and out of the restroom right next to my assigned chair. The smell of cheap bathroom freshener mixed with the expensive perfume my mother was wearing. It was the perfect metaphor for their lives. A cheap, dirty reality covered up by an expensive, artificial scent. I took a slow, deep breath and let the realization wash over me. I owed these women absolutely nothing. I did not give them the satisfaction of an argument. I simply relaxed my shoulders and let a calm smile spread across my face. I looked at my mother, who was still glaring at me, waiting for my submission. I looked at my sister, who had her hands firmly planted on her hips, expecting me to take the plastic seat. Instead of speaking, I carefully placed the large silver gift box I was holding onto the cold floor, right next to the rusted leg of that insulting folding chair. Jasmine frowned, her perfectly shaped eyebrows pulling together in sudden confusion. Before she could open her mouth to complain, I turned my head and looked past her through the open doors of the grand ballroom. I caught a glimpse of my nephew Leo running across the dance floor, wearing a tiny tuxedo. I raised my hand and gave him a bright, gentle wave. He saw me and waved back, a massive smile on his face. That was all I needed. I had shown up for him and my conscience was completely clear. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my smartphone. I calmly unlocked the screen and opened my private banking app. My mother stretched her neck, trying to see what I was doing, but I turned the screen away from her prying eyes. With a few quick taps, I navigated to the joint credit account I had foolishly opened years ago to help my mother with her supposed medical emergencies. I knew exactly what they were planning to do with it later today. I pressed the brightly colored button that read, "Freeze account," instantly severing their access to my hard-earned money. A small green checkmark appeared on the screen, confirming the lock was active. I slipped the phone back into my bag, smoothed out the lapels of my charcoal blazer, and turned my back on them. I walked down that dark, drafty hallway without saying a single word. I heard my mother call my name, her voice sharp and demanding, but I did not stop. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the country club and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The air outside felt incredibly fresh and clean compared to the toxic atmosphere inside the venue. I handed my ticket to the confused valet attendant who had just parked my car less than 20 minutes ago. He quickly retrieved my luxury sedan, and I tipped him generously before sliding into the driver's seat. As the heavy car door closed, it completely sealed off the noise of the country club. The interior of my car was a sanctuary of soft leather and total silence. I pressed the ignition button and the engine hummed to life with a quiet, powerful purr. I drove slowly down the long, winding driveway of the property, passing perfectly manicured golf greens and massive oak trees. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel the crushing weight of family guilt. I did not feel the familiar anxious urge to turn the car around and apologize for things I did not even do. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace and pure liberation. I merged onto the highway, heading back toward downtown Chicago. The skyline was barely visible in the distance, a beautiful silhouette against the bright blue sky. I rolled the window down just a few inches, letting the cool breeze wash over my face. I turned on some soft jazz music and let the steady rhythm match my calm heartbeat. 5 minutes passed in absolute bliss. Then 7 minutes. Then exactly 10 minutes after I had pulled out of the country club parking lot, my peaceful sanctuary was shattered. The large digital display screen on my dashboard suddenly lit up with an incoming call. The name Jasmine flashed in bright red letters. I kept my eyes on the road and let it ring. The ringing stopped, and then immediately started again. This time it was my mother calling. I ignored that one too. Then came a call from Trent. They were all desperately trying to reach the very same woman they had just banished to a restroom hallway. The phone stopped ringing for a second before Jasmine called back. I decided I was finally ready to hear the music. I reached out and tapped the answer button on the screen, putting the call on the loudspeaker. I did not even get a chance to say hello before the sound of pure chaotic panic flooded the quiet interior of my car. Jasmine was not just crying, she was practically hyperventilating. She was screaming my name between violent sobbing gasps. The background noise on her end of the call was absolute bedlam. I could hear angry voices, people shouting, and the distinct sound of heavy doors slamming shut. Jasmine could barely form a complete sentence, she was crying so hard. She begged me to tell her where I was. She demanded that I turn the car around immediately and come back to the Oak Brook Country Club. I kept my voice completely flat and asked her why on earth I would return to a folding chair by the toilets. Jasmine let out a piercing wail that made me wince and turn down the speaker volume. She cried out that the country club manager had just publicly humiliated them in front of all of Trent's wealthy Silicon Valley investors. According to her frantic explanation, the catering director had quietly pulled Trent aside to process the final payment for the extravagant party. They needed to run his card for the remaining $40,000 balance before they would bring out the expensive birthday cake and open the premium dessert buffet. Jasmine sobbed uncontrollably as she told me that Trent's black card had been declined. Not just declined, but confiscated by the machine for suspected fraud. When Trent arrogantly tried to use another card, that one declined too. Every single piece of plastic in his expensive leather wallet was completely maxed out or frozen by the banks. The manager, realizing he was dealing with people who could not pay their massive bill, stopped being polite. Jasmine screamed into the phone that the management had literally cut the power to the DJ booth and turned off the music in the middle of the dance floor. The catering staff had quickly locked the grand double doors to the buffet room, trapping all the expensive food inside. The investors were standing around in the sudden silence, watching Trent argue with security guards in the middle of the lobby. Jasmine was sobbing so violently I could barely understand her final sentence. She begged me to use the emergency card, the one I had just frozen, to save them from total social and financial ruin. I listened to her pathetic sobbing echoing through the premium speakers of my luxury sedan. Just a few hours ago, this exact same woman was standing in a drafty hallway, smirking at me, and telling me I belonged next to a public toilet. She had proudly told me that I was not good enough to sit with her wealthy guests. Now she was begging me, like her entire social existence depended on my mercy. Jasmine demanded that I turn the car around immediately. She ordered me to march back into that country club and hand the angry catering manager my high-limit credit card. She had the absolute nerve to call it her backup card, as if my hard-earned wealth was just a secondary checking account established solely for her personal convenience. She told me to stop being so sensitive over a stupid seating arrangement and just pay the $40,000 balance so the staff would turn the crystal chandeliers back on and feed the important investors who are currently standing in the darkness. I let her finish her frantic entitled demands before I finally spoke. I kept my eyes focused on the highway and made sure my voice was dangerously calm and completely void of any emotion. I reminded Jasmine of the exact financial agreement I had made with our mother Brenda exactly 2 weeks ago. I recalled how our mother had called me crying late at night, claiming Trent was waiting on a massive funding check from his Silicon Valley investors and just needed a tiny bit of help securing the venue for my nephew's birthday. Because I loved my nephew, I had generously agreed to cover the initial $5,000 deposit. I told Jasmine very clearly that $5,000 was the absolute limit of my generosity. I never agreed to pay for the towering champagne pyramids, the imported seafood towers, the custom floral archways, or the final $40,000 catering bill. Jasmine tried to stutter a pathetic excuse, but I cut her off immediately. I told her I knew exactly what she and her arrogant husband had tried to do. I work in corporate finance, and I understand exactly how venue contracts operate. I knew they had kept my credit card information on file with the country club billing department after I paid the deposit. When Trent's own credit cards predictably declined at the manager desk, he had confidently told the staff to just run the secondary card on file. He tried to secretly charge $40,000 to my personal account without my permission, without a single phone call, and without an ounce of moral guilt. They honestly thought I would be sitting meekly in that dark restroom hallway, completely intimidated by their presence, and far too embarrassed to make a public scene when the massive fraud alert popped up on my phone. They fully intended to steal from me and then brush it off later as a simple family misunderstanding. Jasmine went completely silent on the other end of the line. The heavy, anxious breathing and the distant, angry shouting from the country club lobby filled the dead air between us. Finally, she let out a shaky whisper claiming that Trent's investors would pull all their funding if they saw him fail to pay for a simple birthday party. She told me I was intentionally destroying her family and ruining her flawless reputation. I let out a cold, hollow laugh that surprised even me. I told her she destroyed her own family the exact moment she pointed me toward that rusted plastic folding chair. I told her that openly disrespecting the only person who secretly funds your fake luxury lifestyle is the absolute fastest way to go bankrupt. I explained to her in very simple terms so she could clearly understand that the card she tried to fraudulently charge was completely locked. I told her the bank would not approve a single cent, not for the venue, not for the food, and certainly not to save her husband's fragile ego. I heard a sudden scuffle on the phone, and then my mother Brenda was shouting into the receiver, having snatched the phone from Jasmine's hands. My mother demanded that I unlock the card this instant, loudly invoking the holy name of family loyalty and Christian duty. She told me I was being an evil, vindictive sister, and that I would burn in hell for abandoning my own blood in their moment of desperate need. I told my mother that my loyalty had been completely drained dry over the last 10 years. I told them both to walk right back into that dark ballroom, look those wealthy white investors directly in the eye, and explain why the self-proclaimed technology genius could not even afford a slice of vanilla birthday cake. I wished them the absolute best of luck dealing with the furious country club management and the local police officers who were likely already on their way. Then, without waiting for another toxic word to leave my mother's mouth, I reached forward and tapped the red button on my dashboard display. The call disconnected instantly. The car returned to total peaceful silence, save for the soft humming of the engine and the gentle jazz music playing on the radio. I continued driving down the highway, feeling a profound sense of closure that I had never experienced before. For years, I had played the exhausting role of the silent savior. I had covered their debts, paid for their mistakes, and accepted their constant insults because I genuinely believed that was what a good daughter was supposed to do. I had convinced myself that if I just gave them enough money or enough blind support, they would eventually love me and respect me the way they worshipped Trent. But sitting at that venue, Looking at that pathetic chair, I finally realized the painful truth. They did not want a daughter or a sister. They wanted a silent financial hostage. Trent wanted the prestige of wealth without the actual work. Jasmine wanted the luxury aesthetic without the price tag. And my mother wanted the illusion of a perfect upper-class family without having to actually nurture the children she raised. I imagined the scene unfolding back at the country club right at that very moment. I pictured Trent sweating through his custom-tailored suit as the manager loudly explained that his cards were completely useless. I pictured Jasmine watching her carefully curated social media life crumble to pieces as the rich guests whispered and pointed at her tear-stained face. I imagined the investors, those important men they valued so much more than me, awkwardly edging toward the exit doors to escape the embarrassing disaster. The $50,000 party had turned into a spectacular public nightmare, and for the first time in my life, I was not going to run back into the burning building to rescue them. The peace I felt in that moment was completely intoxicating. I watched the city skyline grow closer as I drove back to my real life, leaving their fake empire to burn to the ground. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown Chicago penthouse. I woke up feeling completely refreshed and lighter than I had in over a decade. There was no anxious pit in my stomach and no dread about what crisis my family would drag me into next. I threw off my silk sheets and walked barefoot across the heated marble floors of my master bedroom. My home was my absolute sanctuary. It was a sprawling multi-million-dollar apartment that overlooked the dark blue waters of Lake Michigan. I did not lease it, and I certainly did not rely on a wealthy husband to pay the mortgage. I bought it outright with the massive bonuses I earned from years of grueling 80-hour work weeks in corporate finance. While my sister Jasmine spent her days staging fake luxury photo shoots in rented mansions, I was quietly building actual generational wealth. I walked into my custom kitchen and pressed a single button on my imported espresso machine. The rich smell of expensive coffee filled the quiet air. I poured myself a steaming cup and leaned against the cold granite island, enjoying the absolute silence of my Sunday morning. But my profound peace was abruptly shattered by a sharp mechanical chime. The private elevator that opened directly into my penthouse foyer suddenly hummed to life. I stood up straight and put my coffee mug down on the counter. The front desk security in my building was incredibly strict, and no one was allowed up without my direct authorization. As the heavy steel doors slid open, the terrifying reality dawned on me. My mother Brenda still possessed the emergency elevator keycard I had given her 2 years ago when I was recovering from a minor surgery. I had asked her to return it dozens of times, but she always claimed she had simply misplaced it. Now I knew she had intentionally kept it just in case she ever needed to bypass security and ambush me in my own home. My mother marched out of the elevator first, clutching her designer handbag like a physical weapon. Right behind her was Jasmine, and she looked absolutely terrible. The glamorous pastel aesthetic from the day before was completely destroyed. Jasmine's expensive silk dress was deeply wrinkled and covered in what looked like spilled red wine. Her perfectly styled hair was a frizzy, tangled mess, and dark black mascara was smeared violently down her cheeks. She looked like a woman who had spent the entire night crying hysterically in the passenger seat of a car. Trent stepped out last, and he looked absolutely furious. His usual calm and collected polite white tech executive persona was entirely gone. His face was flushed bright red and his fists were tightly clenched at his sides. He looked like a man desperately searching for someone to physically punish. They stormed right into my beautiful living room, bringing their toxic, chaotic energy into my peaceful sanctuary. I did not move from the kitchen. I just stood there in my silk robe, watching them cross my expensive imported rugs with their dirty shoes. Jasmine saw me standing there looking completely calm, and it sent her into an absolute unhinged frenzy. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and started screaming at the top of her lungs. She did not even bother to say good morning. She immediately accused me of being a cold-hearted monster who actively plotted to destroy her entire life. Jasmine hysterically detailed the total nightmare she had endured after I hung up the phone. She said the country club manager had refused to let them leave the premises. They had physically locked the lobby doors and threatened to call the local police to arrest Trent for massive theft of services. The wealthy Silicon Valley investors that Trent was so desperately trying to impress had to stand there and witness the entire humiliating ordeal. Jasmine cried so hard she could barely catch her breath, telling me that the investors had quietly slipped out the back exit without even saying goodbye. She screamed that one of the guests had actually recorded a video of Trent cursing at the catering staff, and the damning clip was already circulating among their elite social circle. Jasmine sobbed that her influencer brand was completely destroyed. She said her followers were already sending her direct messages, asking why her wealthy husband was detained by venue security. She blamed me for every single second of her humiliation. She told me that if I had just stayed quietly in my seat by the public restroom and handed over my credit card when they asked, none of this would have happened. She completely bypassed the terrifying fact that they tried to steal $40,000 from me and focused entirely on how my refusal to be a victim had ruined her perfect online image. Trent stepped forward, pushing Jasmine slightly to the side so he could confront me directly. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the same way he intimidated his junior employees. He told me I was completely out of line and that my selfish, ignorant behavior had jeopardized millions of dollars in potential startup funding. He spoke to me with such incredible condescension, treating me like a foolish little girl who did not understand how the real corporate world worked. He actually had the audacity to claim that he was doing me a massive favor by allowing me to attend his son's birthday party, and that my presence was supposed to be a quiet privilege. He said my corporate job was nothing compared to the global empire he was building, and that my little stunt proved I lacked the vision to support real tech innovation. He told me I owed him massive financial restitution for the emotional distress I caused his fragile wife and the severe reputational damage I caused his firm. He aggressively demanded I write a check for $100,000 right then and there to cover the country club bill and serve as an apology fund. My mother Brenda nodded along in furious agreement with Trent. She crossed her arms and glared at me with absolute toxic disappointment. She told me I had brought deep, unfixable shame to our entire family name. She said I was a bitter, jealous single woman who could not stand to see her beautiful sister living a successful married life. She demanded that I immediately apologize to Trent for embarrassing him in front of his highly important colleagues. She ordered me to open my checkbook, pay the outrageous demand, and beg for their forgiveness. I stood silently behind my granite kitchen island and let them yell until their voices grew hoarse and weak. I watched them perform their usual pathetic routine of emotional manipulation and aggressive blame shifting. They truly believed that if they screamed loud enough and acted angry enough, I would eventually cave under the heavy pressure just like I always did when I was younger. They thought my quiet, steady demeanor meant I was feeling guilty and preparing to surrender my money. They had absolutely no idea that I was just letting them exhaust themselves before I dropped the final hammer. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked Trent directly in his angry eyes. He thought he was a powerful tech genius dealing with a submissive sister-in-law. He did not know he was standing in the home of the woman who currently owned his entire financial existence. Trent stood there breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive but deeply wrinkled designer shirt. The sophisticated, polite white businessman facade he had so carefully crafted over the years was completely gone. I watched his face shift from red-hot anger to a cold, calculating sense of pure entitlement. He had always played the role of the generous savior in our family. He was the wealthy tech chief executive officer who had graciously elevated my sister from her middle-class roots and brought our family into the elite social circles of the city. He loved being worshipped by my mother and praised by our relatives at every holiday dinner. But right now, in the bright morning light of my kitchen, the mask had completely slipped and shattered on the floor. He ran a trembling hand through his thinning blonde hair and let out a sharp, aggressive sigh. He stopped shouting like a lunatic and instead adopted a low, threatening tone that he probably used to bully his junior developers and intimidate female employees. He told me I was completely out of my depth and that my little stunt at the country club had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction in his fragile business network. He abruptly placed his heavy leather briefcase onto my pristine granite island. The loud, heavy thud echoed through the quiet penthouse, making my mother jump slightly in her place. He unzipped the main compartment with a forceful jerk and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. He slammed the papers down on the counter right next to my steaming coffee mug. I did not flinch or take a step back. I just looked down at the bold black letters printed across the very top page. It was a commercial corporate loan guarantee agreement. I quickly scanned the first few lines with my trained eyes and saw the principal amount clearly typed out in glaring black ink. $2 million. He was not just asking for a small personal loan to cover a bounced catering check from the night before. He was aggressively demanding that I legally bind myself to a massive commercial debt to save his sinking ship. Trent leaned heavily over the granite counter, actively invading my personal space. He pointed a thick finger at the signature line on the bottom of the page and commanded me to sign it immediately. He did not ask for my help. He did not beg for a favor. He ordered me as if I was his subordinate. He told me that since I worked in corporate finance, I understood exactly how emergency bridge loans worked. He said his startup was simply in a temporary cash flow crunch, and that the investors pulling out last night had unfairly frozen his operational funds. He claimed he just needed a temporary guarantor with a flawless credit score and massive liquid assets to secure the loan from his private lenders. He looked around my luxurious penthouse, sweeping his eyes over the expensive modern artwork, the custom furniture, and the breathtaking view of the city skyline. He sneered deeply and said it was finally time for me to pull my weight in the family and put my hoarded wealth to good use instead of living like a selfish spinster. He actually had the absolute nerve to frame this outrageous financial demand as a form of fair repayment. He told me that by abandoning them at the venue and locking my credit card, I had caused severe emotional distress to his fragile wife and irreparable damage to his professional reputation. He said signing this $2 million guarantee was the only way I could legally and morally compensate him for the public trauma I inflicted on his family. He tried to use complex financial jargon to confuse me, throwing around terms like asset collateralization, liquidity ratios, and equity leverage. He spoke slowly and loudly, as if translating a difficult language. He thought because I was a black woman, I somehow only held my executive position by pure luck or corporate diversity quotas. He truly believed he was the absolute smartest person in the room and that he could easily intimidate me into signing away my entire financial future just to appease his towering, fragile ego. Trent leaned even closer, his face just inches from mine. His breath smelled like stale alcohol, bitter coffee, and pure, desperate panic. He lowered his voice into a vicious, venomous whisper and told me that if I refused to sign the contract, he would personally ruin my entire career. He threatened to call the managing partners at my private equity firm and tell them I was mentally unstable, vindictive, and a severe danger to their public corporate image. He said he had incredibly powerful friends in the Chicago business world, and that he could easily have me blacklisted from every major financial institution in the entire Midwest. He told me I was nothing but a glorified diversity hire who counted beans for real innovators and that I owed everything I had to the proximity of his phenomenal success. The absolute racist audacity of his cruel words hung heavy in the quiet air of my beautiful kitchen. He was blatantly demanding that I put my penthouse, my investment portfolios, and my flawless credit rating on the line to save a failing tech company I had absolutely nothing to do with. I stood there looking at the aggressive, desperate white man who had manipulated my entire family for years. I thought about how my mother worshipped the ground he walked on simply because he promised a proximity to wealthy white society and country club memberships. I thought about how my sister changed her entire personality, her voice and her values, just to fit into his shallow, pretentious world. He was so incredibly used to getting exactly what he wanted by bullying people who had far less power than him. He expected me to be terrified by his hollow threats and blindly sign the legal papers just to keep the family peace and protect my own job. But he fundamentally misunderstood exactly who he was dealing with. I did not build my massive wealth by backing down from aggressive, arrogant men in expensive suits. I built my entire career by legally destroying them. I looked down at the $2 million contract resting on my counter and felt a cold, sharp thrill run through my veins. The financial trap he thought he was expertly setting for me was actually the very tool I was going to use to bury him completely and permanently. Before I could even reach for the pen to do what I was about to do, my mother stepped right up to the granite island. She pushed herself between Trent and me, acting like the grand peacemaker, but looking at me with eyes full of pure venom. Brenda placed her manicured hand over the thick stack of legal papers and let out a long, dramatic sigh. She dropped the aggressive shouting and switched to the soft, disappointed tone she had used to control me since I was a little girl. She told me to look at my sister, who was still sobbing pitifully on my expensive living room sofa. She said I was breaking my sister's heart and tearing our beautiful family apart over petty childhood jealousy. My mother leaned in closer, crossing her arms over her chest, and told me she knew exactly why I was acting this way. She claimed I had been bitter ever since we were teenagers. She painted this incredibly twisted picture of our past, saying Jasmine was always the beautiful one, the charming one, the daughter who naturally attracted successful men. She told me I was always too serious, too focused on my boring books, and too intimidating for any decent man to want to marry. She said I was punishing Jasmine simply because Jasmine had achieved the ultimate dream of landing a wealthy white husband and securing a luxurious life in the upscale suburbs, while I was doomed to grow old alone in a cold glass apartment. She actually said my corporate success was just a sad, pathetic compensation for my failure to build a real family. I listened to her completely mesmerized by the sheer depth of her delusion. Brenda did not stop there. She tapped her long acrylic fingernails against the $2 million loan contract and told me it was my sacred duty to sign it. She invoked the heavy, suffocating concept of the strong black woman. She told me that black women are built by God to carry the heavy burdens of their families. She said, "We do not abandon our blood when things get difficult, and we certainly do not embarrass our family in front of the world." She claimed that because the Lord had blessed me with a sharp mind and a ridiculously high-paying corporate job, I owed it to my family to be their permanent financial shield. She told me my money meant absolutely nothing if I did not use it to protect my sister and elevate our family name in the eyes of Trent's highly important white investor friends. She went on to lecture me about how hard Trent worked to give Jasmine a beautiful life and how a simple temporary loan was a minor inconvenience for someone in my specific tax bracket. She paced slightly in front of the island, waving her hands as she spoke. She said I was being incredibly selfish for hoarding my wealth like a greedy dragon, while my own sweet nephew might have to suffer the unimaginable embarrassment of a downgraded lifestyle. She told me to swallow my ridiculous pride, pick up the pen, and be the strong, supportive, loyal sister I was always raised to be. She completely ignored the terrifying fact that Trent had just threatened to destroy my career. She completely ignored the fact that they had actively tried to steal $40,000 from me less than 24 hours ago. In her twisted, manipulated mind, I was the ultimate villain for refusing to be their financial victim, and Trent was the noble victim of unfortunate business circumstances. My mother reached across the smooth counter and physically pushed a heavy silver pen toward my hand. She looked me dead in the eyes and said that if I did not sign that paper right now, I would be completely dead to her. She threatened to call every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family and tell them I was a greedy, heartless woman who abandoned her sister in her darkest hour of need. She said she would make sure I was never welcome at another Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas morning, or summer family reunion ever again. She used the ultimate weapon of total isolation, hoping the deep fear of losing my entire family community would finally force me to surrender to her demands. I looked at the silver pen resting on the dark granite. For a brief second, I felt the ghost of the little girl I used to be. The little girl who desperately wanted her mother's approval and who would do absolutely anything to hear her mother say she was proud of her. I remembered all the times I had quietly emptied my savings account to fix Jasmine's reckless mistakes just to earn a single rare smile from the woman standing in front of me. I remembered working 3 jobs in college while Jasmine received a brand new car just for graduating high school. But that little girl was gone. She had died a long time ago, suffocated by years of financial abuse, emotional neglect, and constant gaslighting. The woman standing in my kitchen right now was a seasoned corporate executive who legally destroyed failing companies before breakfast. I did not feel fear, and I certainly did not feel the toxic guilt she was desperately trying to force down my throat. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute clarity. My mother was not asking me to help her family. She was demanding that I sacrifice my own life, my own hard-earned security to maintain a beautiful lie. She wanted me to set myself on fire just to keep Trent and Jasmine comfortably warm in their mansion. She weaponized my race, my gender, and my familial duty, all to protect a lying, arrogant man who did not even respect her. I looked at my mother and saw exactly what she was. She was not a loving matriarch trying to keep her family together. She was a willing accomplice to my destruction. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen. Trent let out a loud, heavy breath of relief, and my mother finally smiled, her face relaxing into a triumphant, arrogant smirk. Jasmine stopped crying on the couch and sat up quickly, wiping her running mascara with the back of her hand. They all thought they had won the war. They all thought the strong, silent black woman was finally going to do what she was told and carry their massive, heavy burdens just like she always did. They thought the nightmare was over, and they were walking out of my penthouse with a $2 million lifeline to continue their lavish charade. They had absolutely no idea that picking up that pen was the very last peaceful moment they would ever experience in my presence. I held the heavy silver pen in my right hand, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Trent let out a smug little breath and crossed his arms over his chest, completely satisfied with his apparent victory. My mother actually took a step back and gave me a condescending nod of approval, as if I was a disobedient dog finally learning how to heel. Jasmine sniffled and started fixing her messy hair, already planning her next expensive shopping trip in her head. I looked down at the thick stack of legal papers resting on my granite island. The $2 million guarantee that was supposed to chain me to their sinking ship forever. I pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line, but I did not write my name right. Instead, I pressed down so hard the expensive metal tip tore right through the thick paper, scratching the dark granite underneath. Trent lunged forward, opening his mouth to yell, but I did not give him the chance. I dropped the pen, let it clatter across the island, and picked up the entire stack of legal documents. With one swift, deliberate motion, I tore the $2 million contract straight down the middle. The sound of the thick paper ripping echoed loudly in the quiet penthouse. I tossed the torn halves right at Trent's chest. The papers fluttered down and scattered across my clean kitchen floor like trash. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Jasmine let out a high-pitched shriek and jumped up from the sofa. Trent stood frozen, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He demanded to know what the hell I was doing, but his voice was shaking. His arrogant tech chief executive persona was cracking right down the middle, just like his precious contract. I placed my hands flat on the island and leaned forward, looking directly into his terrified eyes. I told him he was a pathetic liar. I told him I knew every single dirty secret he had been desperately trying to hide for the past year. I turned my head and looked at my mother and my sister, who were staring at me in absolute shock. I told them it was time to wake up from their luxurious little dream, because Trent was not a millionaire tech genius. He was a fraud, and he was completely broke. Trent tried to talk over me, sputtering nonsense about temporary cash flow issues and delayed funding rounds. I raised my voice just enough to cut through his pathetic lies and shut him down completely. I told my family exactly what Trent's temporary cash flow issue really meant. I broke it down using simple words so even they could understand the absolute magnitude of his financial ruin. I revealed that his precious startup did not just lose a few investors last night at the country club. The truth was, his company had completely collapsed 8 months ago. I told them exactly how his flagship software product had failed every single beta test, and how his lead developers had quit in disgust because he was bouncing their payroll checks. The Silicon Valley investors he loved to brag about had actually pulled their funding way back in February after discovering he was using their money to fund his personal lifestyle. He had secretly filed for corporate bankruptcy right before the summer while still pretending to be a master of the tech universe. Jasmine started shaking her head aggressively, refusing to process the truth. She pointed at her expensive diamond ring and her designer clothes, demanding to know how they could be broke if they were still living in a massive suburban mansion. I looked at my sister with pure pity and delivered the next massive blow. I told her that every single luxury item she flaunted on the internet was completely financed by toxic high-interest debt. I explained that when the legitimate banks cut Trent off, he panicked and turned to predatory shadow lenders. He took out massive personal loans with astronomical interest rates just to keep up appearances. I told Jasmine that the $50,000 private school tuition, the leased luxury vehicles, and the expensive catering for the birthday party were all paid for by credit lines that were currently entirely maxed out and severely past due. Trent had defaulted on every single financial obligation he had. He had not made a single legitimate mortgage payment on their beautiful mansion in over 6 months. The bank was already preparing the foreclosure paperwork. The only reason they had not been violently evicted yet was because the legal system was incredibly slow. Trent was sweating profusely now. Huge drops of moisture were forming on his forehead and rolling down his flushed face. He looked around the room like a trapped animal desperately searching for an escape route. My mother was clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were turning bright white. She stared at Trent, waiting for him to laugh and say, "I was making it all up." She waited for her perfect white savior to defend himself and put me back in my place. But Trent remained completely silent because he knew I had the exact dates, the exact bank names, and the exact amounts of every single dollar he had stolen and squandered. I told them the $2 million bridge loan he tried to force me to sign was never meant to save his business. There was no business left to save. He simply needed my clean money and my flawless credit score to pay off the dangerous predatory lenders who were actively hunting him down. He wanted me to become the legal hostage for his massive fraudulent debts so he could buy himself a few more months of fake luxury. I looked at Trent and told him he was nothing but a desperate con artist, drowning in an ocean of unpayable debt. I was never going to be his life raft. I watched the color completely drain from my mother's face. The woman who had just threatened to disown me over family loyalty was now staring at her favorite son-in-law like he was a complete stranger. She asked Trent if what I was saying was true, her voice trembling with a terrifying mix of fear and anger. Trent could not even look her in the eye. He stared at the floor, his breathing ragged and uneven, unable to formulate a single coherent lie to save himself. Jasmine stumbled backward and collapsed onto the sofa, holding her stomach, as if she had been physically punched. She started hyperventilating, gasping for air, as the devastating reality of her fake life finally crashed down around her. I stood tall in my kitchen, feeling an incredible rush of power and absolute vindication. For years, they had treated me like a lowly servant simply because I chose hard work over shallow appearances. They had worshipped a man who built his entire kingdom on lies and stolen money. I told them that the public humiliation they experienced at the country club last night was just the absolute beginning of their nightmare. The declined credit card was not a simple banking error. It was a loud, blaring siren announcing the total death of their fraudulent empire. I looked right at Trent and told him that his mask had completely fallen off and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. The silence in my kitchen was so heavy it felt like it was going to shatter the glass windows. Jasmine slowly lifted her head from her hands and looked at the man she had worshipped for the past 7 years. Trent was still staring at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. His silence was the loudest confession he could have possibly made. Jasmine stood up from the sofa, her legs shaking so badly she had to grab the edge of the glass coffee table to steady herself. The shock on her face quickly twisted into something deeply ugly and violent. She took a step toward him, her voice starting as a low, dangerous whisper before escalating into a blood-curdling scream. She asked him if it was true. She demanded to know if the man she married was actually a broke, pathetic failure who had been lying to her face every single morning. Trent flinched at the sheer volume of her voice, but he still did not look up. That was all it took for Jasmine to completely lose her mind. She lunged at him, closing the distance between them in a second. She raised her fists and started hitting him repeatedly in the chest, her expensive acrylic nails catching on his designer shirt. She screamed that he had ruined her entire life. She cried that she had built a flawless influencer brand based entirely on his supposed wealth, and now she was going to be the laughingstock of the entire internet. She told him she had hundreds of thousands of followers who looked up to her luxury aesthetic and that he had humiliated her beyond repair by letting his credit cards decline at a high society event. She was not angry that he had committed massive financial fraud or that he was facing bankruptcy. She was only furious that the flow of endless money had stopped, and her fake public image was completely shattered. Trent took the physical hits for a few seconds before his own simmering rage finally boiled over. He grabbed both of Jasmine's wrists with a brutal, sudden force, stopping her hands in midair. He shoved her backward so hard she stumbled and nearly fell over the edge of the expensive rug. His polite white savior mask was completely gone, replaced by the vicious, snarling face of a cornered predator. He looked at his crying wife with absolute burning hatred and told her to shut her pathetic, ungrateful mouth. He stepped toward her, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of my penthouse. He told her she was the exact reason he was drowning in millions of dollars of unpayable debt. Trent did not hold anything back. He unleashed years of buried resentment right there in my living room. He screamed that he was running a legitimate startup until she decided she needed to live like a reality television star. He aggressively reminded her of her $30,000 a month shopping habit. He pointed his finger in her face and listed off the absurd expenses that had bled his company completely dry. The custom-ordered designer handbags she just had to have for her fake photo shoots. The $50,000 tuition for a private school that their 7-year-old son did not even need. The constant extravagant vacations to luxury resorts that she forced him to book just so she could post carefully edited pictures online to impress people she did not even like. He yelled that her toxic obsession with looking rich on the internet had literally forced him to cook the corporate books. He admitted right out loud that he had to embezzle money from his own investors just to cover her ridiculous credit card statements. He told her that every time he tried to warn her about their shrinking bank accounts, she would throw a massive tantrum and threaten to divorce him and take his son away. He said she was a bottomless black hole of pure vanity and greed, and that no amount of money in the world would ever be enough to satisfy her desperate need for public attention. He laughed a dark, hollow laugh and told her the only reason he turned to illegal shadow lenders was because she demanded a complete kitchen renovation in their mansion, simply because the color of the marble did not match her new aesthetic. Jasmine covered her ears, shaking her head wildly, trying to block out his vicious words. She screamed back that it was his job to provide for her, and that he had promised her a life of ultimate luxury when they got married. She called him a fraud, a loser, and a complete embarrassment to the tech industry. She told him he was lucky a beautiful woman like her had even looked in his direction, and that she was going to divorce him the second she left my apartment. She threatened to take the house, the cars, and every single penny he had left in his name. Trent threw his head back and laughed uncontrollably. It was the frantic, unhinged laughter of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He looked at his hysterical wife and told her to go ahead and hire the most expensive divorce lawyer in the city. He told her she could have the massive suburban mansion and the luxury cars because the bank was coming to repossess every single piece of it by the end of the month anyway. He told her they were millions of dollars in the hole and that she would be lucky if she did not end up in a federal prison right next to him for actively spending the stolen money. The argument exploded into absolute chaos. They were screaming right in each other's faces, spitting venom, and throwing every dark secret they had ever kept into the open air. My mother Brenda tried to step between them, crying and begging them to stop fighting, but Trent viciously shoved her arm away. He told my mother to stay out of it, calling her an ignorant old woman who only liked him because his white skin and deep pockets made her feel superior to her neighbors. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. Her perfect son-in-law, the man she had constantly weaponized against me, had just insulted her in the most degrading way possible. I stood quietly behind my granite kitchen island and watched the spectacular destruction of my toxic family. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to intervene. I just took another sip of my warm coffee and let them tear each other apart. I thought about the thousands of times Jasmine had looked down her nose at my modest corporate suits and my sensible lifestyle. I thought about the countless dinners where Trent had smugly offered to pay the bill just to show everyone how incredibly wealthy he was while secretly drowning in illegal loans. I thought about my mother, who had constantly praised their toxic marriage as the ultimate standard of success, while treating my quiet, honest life like a shameful failure. Now they were nothing but wild animals trapped in a cage of their own making. Jasmine was pacing back and forth across my living room, tearing at her hair and crying so hard her makeup was completely ruined. She was mourning the sudden death of her fake online persona, knowing that her thousands of followers would soon discover she was nothing but a broke fraud. She pointed a shaking finger at Trent and told him she hated him more than anyone else on the planet. She said she had wasted the best years of her youth on a man who could not even afford to buy his own son a slice of birthday cake without bouncing a check. Trent matched her rage with a cold, terrifying bitterness. He told her she was completely delusional if she thought any other man with real money would ever tolerate her endless, shallow demands. He said he had destroyed his own promising career and risked serious federal prison time just to keep her smiling for the cameras. He told her they deserved each other because they were both completely empty inside. The sheer volume of their screaming was deafening, but to me it sounded like absolute justice. The golden child and the white savior were finally exposed, and their perfect kingdom was burning to ash, right before my very eyes. The screaming match eventually died down into heavy, exhausted panting. Jasmine sank back onto my imported living room sofa, burying her face in her hands and sobbing with a hollow, defeated sound that filled the quiet space. Trent leaned heavily against the far wall, staring blankly at the floor, completely drained of his arrogant, aggressive energy. The room was finally quiet, but it was a toxic, suffocating kind of silence. I expected my mother to walk over to her crying daughter to comfort her, or at least demand that Trent pack his bags and leave our family forever. Any normal mother would have been absolutely outraged that a man had just boldly admitted to ruining her daughter's life, manipulating her family, and stealing millions of dollars to fund a fake lifestyle. But my mother was not a normal woman. Instead of comforting Jasmine, she slowly turned her back on her own child and walked right up to my kitchen island. Brenda placed her hands flat on the cold granite and looked at me with an expression of sheer, panicked desperation. She did not yell this time. Her voice was low and shaky, filled with a pathetic kind of pleading that genuinely made my stomach turn. She told me that marriages naturally go through difficult seasons and that highly successful men like Trent are under an immense amount of pressure that ordinary corporate workers like me simply cannot understand. She actually had the audacity to try and justify his massive financial fraud by saying he was just trying to provide a beautiful, high-class life for his family. She said Silicon Valley is a vicious, cutthroat industry, and sometimes good providers have to make complicated, desperate choices to stay afloat. She completely ignored the terrifying fact that he had verbally abused her daughter and viciously insulted her directly just moments ago. In her twisted, status-obsessed mind, losing the prestige of a wealthy white son-in-law was a fate far worse than letting her daughter stay married to a toxic criminal. My mother leaned much closer to me, her eyes wide and frantic, darting around the room as if someone might be listening. She whispered that we absolutely could not let this devastating information get out to the public. She said the wealthy women at her country club and the judgmental gossips at her church would absolutely devour our family if they ever found out Trent was completely bankrupt and facing serious federal charges. She tearfully reminded me of how proudly she had paraded Trent around at the last 3 family reunions, boasting to all our cousins about his successful tech company, his luxury vehicles, and his massive suburban mansion. She said her own personal reputation within our community was entirely tied to his financial success, and if he went down in flames, she would be publicly humiliated right alongside him. She told me she could not survive the shame of facing her friends after bragging about her perfect life for so many years. Then she said the words that truly solidified the absolute depth of her delusion. She told me I had to step in and fix it immediately. She pointed a trembling finger at me and said I was a powerful executive at a massive hedge fund managing multi-million-dollar accounts every single day. She desperately begged me to secretly wire my own personal funds to cover Trent's most aggressive shadow debts before the predatory lenders came knocking on their beautiful front door. She demanded that I use my high-level corporate connections and financial expertise to quietly bail him out of bankruptcy so he could restructure his failing company without going to a federal prison. She promised it would be our little family secret and that Trent would gladly pay me back with interest eventually once his new software finally launched. She was quite literally asking me to commit professional suicide and drain my entire life savings just to cover up the devastating crimes of a man who had just treated us all like absolute garbage. She gripped the edge of the granite island so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She told me I owed it to Jasmine to protect her from the unbearable embarrassment of becoming a divorced, broke, single mother. She said the world is incredibly cruel to Black women who fail at their marriages, and that Jasmine desperately needed the financial stability and social shield of her white husband to maintain her elite standing in their neighborhood. The deeply ingrained self-hatred in my mother's desperate words was absolutely staggering to witness. She was perfectly willing to let me drain my hard-earned wealth, the exact wealth I built through years of exhausting labor and endless sacrifices, just to preserve her pathetic illusion of proximity to white privilege. She saw my entire life as nothing more than a convenient insurance policy for her golden child's mistakes. She started crying actual tears, begging me to be the bigger person for the sake of family unity. She said real family cleanse up after family no matter how dirty the mess is. She told me this was my golden opportunity to finally prove my true loyalty and earn my rightful place in the family hierarchy. She promised that if I just wrote the check and saved his business, Trent would respect me forever and Jasmine would finally treat me like a true equal. She literally dangled her maternal love and family approval right in front of my face, treating our relationship like a cold business transaction. Give us $2 million in cash, and we will finally pretend to actually love you. That was the raw, ugly truth of my entire childhood, laid bare in a single conversation. I looked at the tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no crippling guilt, no lingering desperate desire to be the good supportive daughter. She was actively choosing a fraudulent, abusive man over her own flesh and blood simply because of the fake social status he represented. She was desperately clinging to a rapidly sinking ship and trying to tie a heavy iron anchor around my neck so I would drown right alongside them. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the final heavy ounce of my childhood trauma leave my body forever. I was completely done listening to her pathetic begging. It was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. I turned away from my mother, leaving her desperate pleas hanging in the quiet air of the kitchen. I walked slowly across the wide expanse of my living room, my bare feet making no sound on the expensive hardwood floors. I could feel all three of them watching my every move with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. I walked straight to the large abstract painting hanging on the far wall of my home office space. I reached behind the heavy wooden frame and pressed a hidden button. The painting popped open, revealing a high-security steel wall safe embedded directly into the concrete structure of the building. I typed in my complex numerical passcode, and the heavy metal door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was sealed with bright red tape and stamped with the official insignia of the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the logos of two major federal banks. I carried the heavy file back to the granite kitchen island. My mother took a step back, her eyes darting nervously from my calm face to the intimidating document in my hands. Trent was still leaning against the wall, but his eyes instantly locked onto the red federal stamps. I saw the muscles in his jaw clench so hard, I thought his teeth might crack. He was a fraud, but he was a corporate fraud, and he knew exactly what those official stamps meant. I dropped the thick folder onto the dark granite counter. The loud slap echoed through the room, sounding like a judge's gavel delivering a final, devastating verdict. I looked directly at Trent and told him he had fundamentally misunderstood what I did for a living. I told him he had spent years mocking my corporate career, calling me a glorified accountant and a boring bean counter who lacked the vision to understand real wealth. I explained that my private equity firm did not just manage stock portfolios or advise wealthy clients on tax strategies. We specialized in aggressive debt restructuring and massive corporate liquidation. I told him that when arrogant tech executives run their companies into the ground and default on their illegal shadow loans, the predatory lenders panic and sell off that toxic debt to firms exactly like mine for pennies on the dollar. I watched the color completely drain from Trent's face as he slowly realized where this was going. His arrogant posture collapsed entirely, and he gripped the edge of the kitchen counter just to keep himself standing. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady as I delivered the ultimate blow. I told him that exactly 3 weeks ago, my firm had purchased a massive bundle of high-risk, defaulted commercial debt from a group of very desperate private lenders. I explained that when the manifest of toxic assets crossed my massive mahogany desk, I saw a very familiar name sitting right at the very top of the list. It was his name and the name of his bankrupt technology startup. Jasmine was staring at me blankly, clearly struggling to understand the complex financial reality of what I was saying. My mother was looking back and forth between Trent and me, her face pale and terrified. I decided to make it incredibly simple for them so there could be absolutely no escape from the truth. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the thick red folder. I told Jasmine that her husband did not owe money to some faceless bank or distant group of angry Silicon Valley investors anymore. I told her that my corporate firm had legally purchased every single one of his defaulted loans. We bought the liens on his luxury vehicles, the high-interest credit lines he used to buy her designer bags, and the massive fraudulent commercial debts he took out to supposedly fund his fake company. I looked back at Trent and let a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. I told him that when I saw his catastrophic financial file, I personally walked into the senior partner's office and demanded to handle his specific case. I told him I was officially appointed as the primary liquidator for his entire corporate estate. I explained what that meant in plain English so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. I told him I held the legal deeds to his assets, I controlled the promissory notes, and I possessed the absolute legal authority to seize everything he had ever touched. I told him I literally owned his financial soul. Trent let out a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a whimper. The man who had confidently barged into my home an hour ago, demanding I sign a $2 million guarantee, was now physically shrinking before my eyes. He realized that the woman he had banished to a plastic chair by the country club toilets was the exact same woman who currently held the power to completely destroy his life with a single signature. He realized that the emergency bridge loan he was so desperate to secure was never going to happen because the person he was begging to guarantee the loan was actually the person collecting his massive mountain of debt. I told my mother that her tearful demands for me to secretly bail him out were completely pointless. I told her I could not write him a check to save him from his creditors because I was the creditor. I told her the massive, terrifying debt collector she was so desperately afraid of was standing right in front of her drinking morning coffee in a silk robe. I told them they had walked right into the lion's den demanding the lion become their obedient pet. The absolute poetic justice of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. I stood tall behind my kitchen island, looking at the three people who had abused, manipulated, and underestimated me for my entire life. They were completely at my mercy, and they finally knew it. Trent began to shake violently, his hands trembling as he stared at the federal file. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There were no more lies he could tell, and no more fake wealth he could flaunt to intimidate me. I told him our firm had conducted a deep forensic audit on his accounts during the acquisition process. We found every hidden offshore account, every fake vendor invoice, and every forged signature he used to steal money from his original backers. He knew the red stamps on the file meant the federal authorities were already involved. Jasmine began to cry again, but this time it was not a loud theatrical tantrum meant to gather sympathy. It was a quiet, terrified sobbing of a woman who finally understood that her luxurious fake world was officially dead and buried forever. My mother stared at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a terrifying stranger she no longer recognized. I felt an overwhelming surge of absolute power and total liberation. The golden child, the perfect white savior, and the toxic mother were finally brought to their knees by the very daughter they had relentlessly tried to break. I let the heavy silence stretch for a few more seconds before I turned my attention entirely to my mother. Brenda was standing completely still, her eyes glued to the red-stamped folder on the counter. She was still desperately trying to process the terrifying reality that her perfect son-in-law was a criminal. I knew the human brain has a funny way of protecting itself from total trauma. I could see a faint glimmer of desperate hope in her eyes, as she probably thought to herself that at least her own personal finances were completely secure. She probably believed she could simply pack up Jasmine and her grandson, take them back to her beautiful, fully paid-off home in the suburbs, and they could ride out this terrible storm together in the safety of her house. I reached out and slowly opened the thick, heavy folder. The sound of the crisp paper turning made Trent physically flinch. He knew exactly what document was coming next, and he turned his face away toward the wall, bracing for the final, fatal impact. I pulled out a single document, printed on thick legal paper, and slid it across the smooth granite surface, directly toward my mother. It was not a corporate ledger or a business loan. It was a residential property deed attached to a massive high-interest mortgage agreement. I looked at my mother and asked her if she remembered a warm Sunday afternoon back in early spring when Trent visited her house completely alone. I calmly reminded her of how she had called me that very same evening, bragging about how her wonderful son-in-law was helping her set up a sophisticated retirement trust fund. She had proudly told me that Trent brought over a stack of complicated financial papers for her to sign, claiming he was using his elite connections to secure her financial future and protect her assets. Brenda looked down at the document, her hands beginning to shake violently. I saw her eyes scan the bold printed words at the very top of the page. She did not understand the dense financial terminology, but she instantly recognized the address printed clearly in the center of the page. It was her exact address. It was the beautiful four-bedroom colonial house she had lived in for over 30 years. The very house she had proudly paid off completely after my father passed away. I watched her face contort in absolute confusion as she looked up at me, asking what this document was doing in a file full of Trent's corporate commercial debts. I did not sugarcoat a single word. I told her in the clearest, most direct way possible, so she could not hide behind any more delusions. I explained that when Trent's investors abandoned him 8 months ago, he was incredibly desperate for a massive influx of cash. He needed hundreds of thousands of dollars immediately just to keep the lights on in his sprawling mansion and keep Jasmine from noticing the missing money. No legitimate bank in the country would touch him, and the illegal shadow lenders he turned to demanded hard, tangible collateral before they would hand over a single dime. I pointed a steady finger at the paper and told my mother that Trent did not set up a retirement trust fund for her that sunny afternoon in spring. He manipulated her into signing a commercial property lien. He secretly remortgaged her fully paid-off home, pulling every single dollar of equity out of it to feed his dying company and Jasmine's toxic shopping habits. My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. She looked at Trent, her eyes wide with sheer, unfiltered panic. She begged him to tell her it was a mistake. She pleaded with him to explain the paperwork and tell me I was completely wrong. But Trent could not even look at her. He kept his eyes focused on the floor, his face pale and covered in a cold sweat. He knew he had committed the ultimate betrayal, and there was absolutely no way to deny it, with the signed legal documents sitting right in front of them on my kitchen island. I tapped the signature line at the bottom of the page. I told my mother to look closely at her own handwriting. I told her she had blindly signed away her entire life savings and her only physical sanctuary just because a white man in an expensive suit smiled at her and used a few big financial words she did not understand. She had trusted him implicitly because he represented the wealthy upper-class status she worshipped so deeply, and he had used that blind, pathetic devotion to completely rob her blind right in her own living room. Jasmine stopped crying for a brief second and stared at Trent in absolute horror. Even she could not comprehend the magnitude of what he had done to their own mother. I turned to Jasmine and told her that the expensive diamond tennis bracelet Trent bought her for their anniversary last month was quite literally paid for with the roof over our mother's head. The extravagant private school tuition, the imported cars, and the $50,000 birthday party were all funded by the stolen equity of the house we grew up in. I wanted Jasmine to know that her beautiful fake influencer lifestyle was built on the absolute destruction of her mother's future. My mother reached out with a trembling hand and touched the document. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed heavily onto one of the tall kitchen bar stools, gripping the edge of the granite counter just to stay upright. The devastating reality of the situation finally crushed her. I told her that because Trent had defaulted on the predatory loan 3 months ago, the aggressive lenders had already initiated the foreclosure process on her property. And because my firm had just purchased that exact debt portfolio, I was now the legal owner of her house. Her beautiful, perfectly manicured home, the one she used to establish her dominance in her social circles, was now nothing more than collateral for a bad debt sitting securely in my corporate file. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was not good enough. I looked at the mother who had just ordered me to drain my own bank accounts to save the criminal standing in my living room. I told her that her blind loyalty to a fake white savior had cost her absolutely everything she valued in this world. She had literally handed over the keys to her castle to a con artist simply because he drove a nice car and made her feel culturally important. The absolute silence that followed my words was heavy and completely suffocating. My mother sat there staring at her own signature, crying silent tears of total devastation, knowing that the daughter she threw away was now the one holding the deed to her entire life. The suffocating silence in my kitchen finally broke when Trent suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. He realized the conversation was no longer just about losing his tech company or losing a house. We were now talking about serious federal crimes. The sheer panic in his eyes morphed into a desperate, dangerous kind of anger. He pushed himself off the wall and marched back up to the granite island, slamming his heavy hand down right next to the red-stamped folder. He leaned his entire body weight over the counter, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me one last time. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and ordered me to keep my mouth shut. His voice was shaking, but he tried to make it sound deep and threatening. He told me I was bound by strict corporate confidentiality agreements, and that if I dared to share his private financial documents with anyone outside of my firm, he would sue me for everything I owned. He threatened to hire the most aggressive defense lawyers in the city to drag my name through the mud and have my financial licenses permanently revoked. He was practically spitting as he spoke, desperately trying to construct a legal cage around me. He told me that corporate liquidations happen privately all the time, and that we could just settle this quietly behind closed doors. He demanded that I bury the forged mortgage document deep in my firm archives and simply write off his massive shadow debts as a bad corporate investment. He actually thought he could still bully me into protecting him. He thought he could use empty legal threats to force me to become an active accessory to his massive financial crimes. I stood my ground and did not lean away from him. I looked at the beads of sweat rolling down his red face, and I let a slow, genuine smirk spread across my lips. It was a cold, calculating smile that made Trent stop talking and swallow hard. I told him he was incredibly arrogant to think standard non-disclosure agreements somehow covered federal felonies like wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I asked him if he honestly believed I would risk my own flawless professional reputation and my freedom just to cover up the fact that he was a sloppy, desperate thief. I crossed my arms and took a step back from the counter, letting him fully absorb what I was about to say. I told him he was entirely too late with his pathetic threats. I explained my morning routine to him in vivid detail. I told him that I always wake up early on Sundays to enjoy the quiet city. I said that this morning I woke up at exactly 5 o'clock, brewed my espresso, and sat down at my custom glass desk overlooking the lake. I told him I opened my encrypted corporate laptop and pulled up a massive digital dossier I had been compiling on him for the last 3 weeks. I explained that the dossier contained absolutely everything. It had the bank records of the money he secretly wired to offshore accounts right before he filed for corporate bankruptcy. It had the emails where he instructed his accountants to fabricate the software beta test results to trick his original investors. And most importantly, it had high-resolution scans of the forged property deed where he stole the equity from my mother's fully paid-off house. Trent's mouth fell open and the color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stammered, asking me what I did with the digital dossier. I looked at him with absolute triumph and delivered the final fatal blow. I told him I did not just send it to my firm's internal compliance department. At exactly 6 o'clock this morning, I attached that massive file to a highly secure encrypted email. And then I sent it directly to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the lead investigator of the White-Collar Crime Division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Chicago. The words FBI hung in the air like a physical weapon. Jasmine let out a piercing scream from the sofa, completely losing her mind at the realization that her husband was going to federal prison. My mother put her head down on the cool granite counter and began to weep loudly, mourning the complete destruction of her family reputation. Trent stumbled backward, clutching his chest, as if he was having a heart attack. I told him I had actually hesitated for weeks. I told him that despite everything my family had done to me, I struggled with the decision to pull the trigger on the federal investigation. A small, naive part of me still wanted to find a way to liquidate his assets, quietly, just to spare my nephew the trauma of seeing his father arrested. But then I looked at Trent and Jasmine and reminded them of yesterday afternoon. I reminded them of the dark, drafty hallway at the country club. I reminded them of the flimsy plastic folding chair pushed right up against the men's restroom doors. I told Trent that when he and my sister banished me to that disgusting hallway to hide me from his wealthy white investors, they sealed their own fate. I told him that when he tried to secretly steal $40,000 from my credit card to pay for a party he could not afford, he killed any remaining ounce of mercy I had left in my heart. The bathroom chair incident was the exact motivation I needed to finally stop protecting them. I told him that sitting in my quiet car driving away from their fake luxury party, I realized they were never going to change and they were never going to stop using me. So this morning when I sat at my computer looking at the send button, I did not hesitate at all. I clicked it with absolute joy. I told Trent the federal agents had been reviewing his files for over 4 hours now. I explained that right at this very moment, federal prosecutors were likely drafting the arrest warrants and filing emergency motions to permanently freeze every single bank account associated with his name. I told him his passport was completely useless, and his fraudulent empire was officially over. There were no more lies to tell, no more fake investor meetings to stage, and no more luxury parties to throw. The entire game was finished, and I was the one who personally called the referees. I slowly turned my attention away from Trent and focused entirely on my sister. Jasmine was curled up on the edge of my expensive living room sofa, sobbing so violently her shoulders were visibly shaking. She was mourning the sudden, terrifying loss of her perfect white savior husband and the rapidly approaching reality of his federal prison sentence. But I was not finished delivering the truth. I looked at her ruined makeup and told her she needed to save some of those heavy tears because she was crying for the wrong reason entirely. I told her Trent going to a federal penitentiary was actually the absolute least of her immediate daily problems. Jasmine looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, struggling to comprehend how things could possibly get any worse than her husband being investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I took a slow step toward her, making sure she heard every single word I was about to say. I told her that when you buy toxic defaulted debt, you do not just sit around waiting for the courts to process the paperwork. I told her my firm moves incredibly fast to secure our financial assets before desperate criminals can hide them. I asked Jasmine if she honestly thought the federal authorities were the only phone calls I made this morning. I watched her face drop as I explained that as the primary liquidator of their massive mountain of debt, I had the absolute legal right to instantly recall the collateral on all of their severely delinquent accounts. I told her I had personally signed the emergency seizure orders right after I sent the encrypted email to the authorities. I looked down at my watch and told her that exactly 45 minutes ago, a small army of aggressive private repossession agents had arrived at her massive suburban mansion. Jasmine let out a choked gasp and her hands flew to her mouth. I painted a very clear and vivid picture of exactly what was happening at her house right at this very second. I told her the agents were not just there to change the locks on the front doors. They were there to legally extract every single luxury item that had been purchased with stolen money and fraudulent credit lines. I told her they were currently boxing up her massive collection of custom designer handbags, tossing her precious leather purses into cheap brown cardboard boxes. I told her they were emptying her massive velvet-lined jewelry boxes, taking back the diamond tennis bracelets, the heavy gold necklaces, and the expensive luxury watches Trent had bought her to keep her quiet and happy. I told her the two expensive leased sports cars, sitting in her wide circular driveway, the exact vehicles she loved to pose in front of for her internet followers, were already strapped to the back of flatbed tow trucks. I told her the repo men were stripping her beautiful fake influencer kingdom down to the bare drywall. Jasmine started shaking her head aggressively, completely refusing to believe me. She stammered that I was lying to her and that no one could legally enter her home without her explicit permission. She frantically dug into her expensive ruined designer purse and pulled out her smartphone, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it on the floor before picking it back up. She quickly opened the application that connected to the expensive security cameras surrounding her sprawling property. My mother leaned over desperately, trying to look at the bright screen. I stood completely still and watched the horrifying reality wash over my sister's face in real time. Through the live video feed, Jasmine watched three large commercial repo trucks parked directly on her perfectly manicured front lawn. She watched large men in heavy work boots carrying boxes of her expensive clothes and shoes out the front door, loading them into the back of dark, unmarked vans. She watched a tow truck driver secure thick, heavy chains to the front axle of her pristine, white luxury utility vehicle. The beautiful, wealthy neighbors she had spent years desperately trying to impress were standing on their perfectly swept sidewalks watching the spectacular, humiliating show. I told Jasmine her perfect online followers could not save her now. I told her the wealthy country club women she desperately wanted to be friends with were probably already texting each other, taking pictures of the repo trucks and laughing at her total dramatic downfall. I asked her how she planned to maintain her flawless luxury aesthetic on the internet when she did not even own the expensive clothes on her back. Jasmine dropped her phone onto the glass coffee table, the screen still showing the live feed of her entire fake life being packed away. She buried her face in her hands and let out a long, agonizing wail that sounded like pure physical pain. This was the exact same woman who just yesterday told me my tailored corporate suit was boring and that I would ruin the glamour of her son's party. This was the woman who expected me to sit by a public restroom simply because I chose to work hard and invest my money instead of spending it on flashy, ridiculous items to impress strangers. I looked at her crying miserably on my sofa and felt an incredible sense of deep, satisfying closure. I told her she had spent her entire adult life treating me like a pathetic loser simply because I did not care about designer labels or elite country club memberships. She had looked down on me for being single and focused on my career while she paraded around pretending to be a wealthy socialite. I told her the only difference between us was that everything I owned was completely real and fully paid for by my own hands. I told her she was nothing but a hollow shell wrapped in expensive stolen fabric, and now that fabric was being forcefully ripped away. She had built her entire identity on objects and status symbols she could never actually afford. I told her that when the repo men were finally finished sweeping through her massive house, she would be forced to look in the mirror and see the empty, shallow person she truly was. She would have to go on the internet and face the hundreds of thousands of people she had actively lied to every single day. The glamorous luxury influencer was completely dead, and all that was left was a broke, crying fraud sitting in her sister's living room. I told Jasmine her kingdom of lies was officially dismantled and she was never getting any of it back. I turned my eyes away from my sobbing sister and looked down at my mother. Brenda had been watching Jasmine's breakdown with absolute terror in her eyes. The reality of the repo men tearing apart her daughter's mansion had finally shattered whatever fragile delusion she had left holding her together. She slowly turned her head and looked at the forged mortgage document still resting on the dark granite island. She realized that the exact same ruthless corporate machine that was currently stripping Jasmine of her fake wealth was coming for her next. Her legs simply gave out completely. My mother, the proud, arrogant woman who had spent her entire life looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her social class, dropped heavily to her knees right in the middle of my living room. She crawled forward on the expensive rug until she was right at the base of the kitchen island. She reached up with trembling hands and grabbed the edge of the smooth stone. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her carefully powdered face, completely abandoning her dignified matriarch persona. She begged me to save her. She pleaded with me using a high-pitched, broken voice that I had never heard her use before. She asked me to simply take the forged mortgage document and rip it into pieces right there in front of her. She begged me to log into my corporate laptop and quietly cancel the debt to erase the foreclosure process and to give her back the deed to her house. She cried out that she was an old woman and that she could not possibly survive being homeless at her age. She told me she had worked her entire life to pay off that beautiful colonial house, and that it was the only thing of actual value she had left in the world. She tried to reach out and grab my hand, but I took a slow, deliberate step backward, keeping my distance. She looked at me with absolute desperation and played her final pathetic card. She told me I was a good Christian daughter and that God would severely punish me if I threw my own mother out onto the street. She begged me to show mercy and forgive her for all the terrible things she had said to me over the years. I stood tall behind the counter looking down at the woman kneeling on my floor. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy or guilt. I kept my voice perfectly flat and ice cold as I delivered my final verdict. I told her that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who actually showed remorse before they got caught. I told her she was not crying because she felt guilty for treating me like a worthless scapegoat for 34 years. She was only crying because the man she had chosen over me had completely destroyed her, and she had nowhere else to run. I reminded her of every single time she had enabled their toxic abuse. I told her about the countless holidays where she forced me to sit at the end of the table while she praised Trent for his fake business success. I reminded her of just yesterday when she grabbed my arm in that dark, drafty hallway and ordered me to accept my humiliating place next to a public restroom. I told her that for 3 decades, she had actively rewarded Jasmine's cruelty and worshipped Trent's arrogant white privilege while treating my hard work and quiet dedication like an embarrassing family secret. She had handed her entire life and her fully paid off home over to a total fraud simply because he promised to elevate her social status. I told her I was not going to rip up the legal documents. I told her I was not going to cancel the debt or erase the foreclosure. I explained that my corporate firm had spent millions of dollars acquiring Trent's massive portfolio of toxic loans, and I had a strict legal and fiduciary responsibility to liquidate every single piece of collateral attached to those debts. I told her that included her beautiful, sprawling colonial home. I told her the house did not belong to her anymore, and it certainly did not belong to Trent. It belonged to my firm, and I was the one making the final executive decisions. My mother let out a horrific, agonizing scream and buried her face in her hands. She rocked back and forth on her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged me to tell her where she was supposed to go and how she was supposed to live. I looked at Trent, who was still standing frozen by the wall, completely unable to look at the woman he had just rendered entirely homeless. I pointed at him and told my mother she should go ask her perfect wealthy son-in-law for a place to stay. I suggested they could all move into a cheap motel together once the federal agents were finished seizing everything they owned. I leaned over the counter and looked directly down at my weeping mother. I told her the legal foreclosure process had already been expedited due to the severe fraudulent nature of the original loan. I told her the bank had already finalized the paperwork and the local sheriff's department had the official eviction notices printed and ready. I gave her the absolute final timeline of her destruction. I told her she had exactly 7 days to pack up whatever personal belongings Trent had not already stolen and vacate the premises completely. I told her that on the morning of the 8th day, the authorities would arrive at her front door to physically remove her and change all the locks. I told her the beautiful house she used to host her pretentious garden parties and judge her neighbors would be sold at a public auction to the highest bidder to satisfy her son-in-law's massive criminal debts. I told her she had exactly 1 week to say goodbye to her perfect suburban life before she was forcefully thrown out into the cold reality she had created for herself. She collapsed entirely onto the floor, weeping into the expensive fibers of my rug, completely broken and utterly defeated. I watched her cry and felt the final heavy chains of my childhood trauma snap and fall away forever. I stood there in the absolute silence of my kitchen, watching my mother sob into the floorboards. The air in the room felt incredibly light for the first time in my entire life. But the quiet peace was suddenly shattered by a guttural, animalistic sound coming from the other side of the room. I shifted my gaze and saw Trent pushing himself off the wall. The final realization of his complete and total destruction had finally short-circuited whatever rational thought he had left in his brain. He was completely cornered, and he knew it. His stolen money was gone, his fraudulent business was seized, his dark secrets were exposed to the federal authorities, and the women he had manipulated for years were currently weeping on my expensive rug. He looked at me standing calmly behind the granite island, and his face twisted into an expression of pure, unhinged madness. He blamed me for absolutely everything. He did not see his own criminal actions as the cause of his massive downfall. He only saw me as the evil architect of his ruin. Trent let out a furious, deafening scream and charged directly at me. He lunged across the wide living room, his large hands reaching out like heavy claws aiming right for my throat. He wanted to physically hurt me to wipe the calm, victorious expression off my face and regain some pathetic sense of physical control over the situation. Jasmine shrieked in absolute terror, but she did not move a single muscle to stop him. My mother gasped and covered her head, cowering on the floor. But I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back, and I certainly did not scream for help. I just stared right into his wild, desperate eyes because I knew he was never going to reach me. Exactly 10 minutes ago, while they were all distracted by their own toxic screaming match, I had subtly reached under the lip of my kitchen counter and pressed the silent emergency security button wired directly to the front desk of my building. Before Trent could even close the distance between us, the heavy steel doors of my private elevator slid open with a sharp mechanical ding. Three massive private security guards stepped out into the foyer, moving with incredible speed and strict military precision. Trent did not even have time to turn his head to see what was happening behind him. The lead guard, a towering man with incredibly broad shoulders, lunged forward and tackled Trent right around his waist. The sheer force of the impact lifted Trent entirely off his feet, flying through the air for a brief second. They crashed down onto the expensive hardwood floor with a massive, sickening thud that actually made the thick glass coffee table rattle. Trent slammed his face against the polished wood, letting out a sharp, pathetic groan of pain as the heavy guard pinned him firmly to the ground. The second guard immediately dropped to his knees, grabbing Trent's arms and twisting them forcefully behind his back. Trent started thrashing wildly like a captured feral animal, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the floor and screaming absolute nonsense. He shouted that he was a wealthy technology executive and that they had absolutely no right to touch him. He threatened to sue the entire luxury building and have the guards permanently fired, but his pathetic threats were completely muffled by the heavy knee pressing down intensely on his back. The guards did not say a single word to him. They operated with cold professional efficiency, snapping thick plastic zip ties tightly around his wrists and hauling him up from the floor like a heavy sack of garbage. Trent's custom-tailored shirt was torn at the collar. His face was bruised from the floor, and his perfect white savior hair was a sweaty, chaotic mess. Jasmine jumped up from the sofa, completely hysterical, holding her shaking hands out toward her husband, but she was far too terrified of the massive guards to actually step forward and help him. She cried and begged them to let him go, screaming that he was a good man and that I was the one who was crazy and vindictive. The third security guard, a tall, stern-looking woman, stepped directly in front of Jasmine and pointed a firm finger toward the open elevator. She told Jasmine and my mother that they were officially trespassing on private property and that they needed to vacate the penthouse immediately or they would be forcefully arrested by the city police, who were already on their way. My mother slowly pulled herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter for support. She looked completely aged, almost fragile, as the last remaining shreds of her arrogant pride dissolved into absolute nothingness. She did not look at me again. She simply stared at the floor, her face completely pale and devoid of any emotion resembling the strong matriarch she always pretended to be. Jasmine grabbed our mother's arm, pulling her toward the elevator, sobbing violently and cursing my name with every single step she took. The guards shoved Trent forward, forcing him to walk toward the steel doors. He turned his head and glared at me one last time, his eyes burning with pure, helpless hatred, but I just raised my coffee mug and gave him a slow, dismissive wave. The heavy steel doors slid shut completely, cutting off their screams and returning my penthouse to absolute blissful silence. I walked over to the digital security panel mounted on my wall and tapped the screen to access the live camera feeds from the ground floor lobby. I wanted to watch the very end of their humiliating journey out of my life. The high-definition camera flickered on, showing the grand marble lobby of my luxury building. It was a busy Sunday morning, and the lobby was filled with incredibly wealthy residents sipping coffee, reading newspapers, and waiting for the valet to bring their cars. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor and the guards marched Trent out into the bright open space. The entire lobby went completely silent. Every single person stopped what they were doing and stared in absolute shock as the screaming, struggling man in the torn designer suit was forcefully dragged across the pristine white marble floor. Jasmine and my mother followed right behind him, completing the pathetic parade of total public disgrace. Jasmine was covering her face with her hands, weeping loudly, her ruined makeup smeared all over her fingers, and her expensive dress wrinkled beyond repair. My mother walked with her head bowed, completely humiliated. unable to make eye contact with any of the elegant people staring at them. The wealthy residents they had spent their entire lives trying to emulate and impress were now looking at them with sheer absolute disgust and pity. They were literally being thrown out into the busy city street like common criminals causing a massive disruptive scene. I watched the security guards push Trent through the revolving glass doors and out onto the concrete pavement, where a city police cruiser was already pulling up to the curb, with its bright red and blue lights flashing. I reached out and pressed the button to turn off the security screen, letting out a long, deep breath. The ultimate humiliation was finally complete. Their fake empire was reduced to rubble, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. The days and weeks that followed that explosive Sunday morning were some of the quietest and most peaceful moments I had ever experienced in my entire adult life. There were no more frantic phone calls demanding emergency cash. There were no more passive-aggressive text messages from my mother comparing me to my supposedly perfect sister. I went absolutely and completely no contact. I changed my personal cell phone number. I routed all of their email addresses directly to a blocked folder, and I gave the front desk security team strict permanent instructions to call the city police immediately if anyone matching their descriptions ever stepped foot near my luxury building again. I completely severed the rotten branches of my family tree, and the amount of personal growth I experienced in that newfound sunlight was absolutely incredible. The federal justice system moved with terrifying speed when presented with the mountain of undeniable digital evidence I had handed them. Trent did not even have the chance to put on one of his arrogant, expensive suits and pretend to be a victim in a courtroom. His expensive private lawyers took one single look at the forged mortgage documents, the offshore wire transfers, and the fake corporate ledgers, and immediately dropped him as a client. His public defender advised him to accept a harsh plea deal. The wealthy white tech chief executive officer who used to demand that I sit by public restrooms is currently sitting in a medium-security federal penitentiary. He traded his custom-tailored blazers for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, and he will not be seeing the outside of a concrete cell for at least the next 10 years. He went from a fake millionaire to just another federal inmate number, and all of his arrogant pride was completely stripped away. As for my mother and my sister, they experienced a completely different kind of terrible prison. True to my word, the foreclosure process on the sprawling colonial house moved forward without a single hitch. My mother was forcefully evicted by the county sheriff exactly 8 days after she kneeled on my living room floor. Because the repo men had already completely stripped Jasmine's suburban mansion of every single valuable asset, the two of them were left with absolutely nothing but a few suitcases of cheap clothes and the heavy, crushing weight of their own ruined reputations. With zero credit, no actual job skills, and no wealthy husband to drain, Dry Jasmine was forced to face the harsh reality of the real working world. The former luxury influencer, who used to turn her nose up at my corporate career, is now working a minimum-wage retail job at a local discount clothing store in a cheap strip mall. She spends 8 hours a day standing on her aching feet, folding cheap sweaters, and getting yelled at by angry customers while desperately trying to hide her face from anyone she used to know in her fake high society life. My mother and Jasmine had to pool their pathetic minimum-wage earnings just to afford a tiny, run-down one-bedroom apartment in a deeply undesirable neighborhood far outside the city limits. The two women who used to proudly bond over their shared toxic vanity and mutual hatred of my independence are now permanently trapped in a cramped, dirty space together. I heard through a distant cousin that they spend their days bitterly screaming at each other, blaming one another for the complete destruction of their glamorous lives. My mother resents Jasmine for bringing a massive fraud into her home and losing the house, while Jasmine resents my mother for not magically forcing me to bail them out of debt. They are locked in an endless, miserable cycle of poverty and mutual disgust, which is the exact poetic justice they both truly deserve. Despite cutting them out of my life completely, I did not let their toxic legacy ruin the next generation. I reached out to my corporate attorneys and established a highly secure, heavily guarded educational trust fund for my young nephew Leo. I seeded the account with enough money to completely cover his future college tuition and ensure he has a solid foundation to start his actual adult life. But I made the legal stipulations incredibly airtight. Jasmine and Trent cannot access a single penny of that money for any reason whatsoever. The funds are locked away completely untouchable until the exact day Leo turns 18 years old and officially enrolls in a university. I wanted to make sure he had a fighting chance to escape the cycle of lies and manipulation he was unfortunately born into. Tonight I am standing in the center of my quiet penthouse holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine. I am looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun slowly set over the gorgeous Chicago skyline. The vibrant orange and deep purple light reflects off the dark waters of the lake, creating a picture of absolute perfect peace. I used to think that setting boundaries with family was an act of extreme cruelty. I used to believe the heavy lies my mother fed me about how strong Black women are supposed to carry the massive burdens of their relatives, no matter how much it destroys them internally. But standing here looking at the incredible life I built with my own two hands, I finally know the absolute truth. Blood simply makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and genuine love are what actually make you a family. Sometimes the most beautiful and necessary thing you can ever do for yourself is to walk away from the people who are actively trying to drown you. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that broke you, and you cannot save people who are fully committed to their own destruction. It took me 34 years to learn how to put the heavy baggage down and walk away, but I am finally completely free. Have you ever had to make the agonizing decision to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace and financial security? Have you ever had to walk away from people who completely underestimated your worth and tried to use you for their own selfish gain? I would absolutely love to hear your powerful stories of setting boundaries in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that protecting your own peace is the ultimate form of self-care. Thank you so much for joining me on this wild journey, and always remember that you are the sole author of your own life story. Do not ever let anyone else hold the pen.